Hi everyone, my name is Corie and we are reading through the Bible in 1 year. Today we are recapping our weekly reading from 2 Chronicles chapter 15 to the end of the book of Ezra, which is chapter 10. So much to cover. Let's get to it. 2 Chronicles chapter 15, we are in the reign of Asa, king of Judah. Remember, we've had Saul, David, Solomon, Rehoboam, Abijah, and now Asa. So that's where we are in the line. He is the 6th king of Israel, technically, but it is that split kingdom of Israel. Okay, so Asa is a good king. He's removed all of the idolatry that had been going on since the days of Solomon. And in chapter 15, Asa begins massive religious reforms throughout the entire country. And over all of the cities that he had captured in war. So he's tearing down idols and high places and all that. He repairs the altar of the temple in Jerusalem. So that had been reconfigured. So he has to repair that. And apparently because of all of his success and his religious faithfulness to God, that was a contrast to what was going on in northern Israel. A lot of people from northern Israel actually defected and joined Judah because of this, because of Asa's success. So Asa held an assembly of all Israel, and he makes a covenant. We see this a lot with godly kings, is they renew the covenant first that Moses made with the people at Mount Sinai, and then that Joshua made with the people when they were coming into the promised land at, Shechem with Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, that whole scenario. So you're going to see this pattern when a godly king arises, they're going to renew a covenant with their generation of people and God. Okay, so Asa does this. He makes a covenant between God and the people. He also deposes his grandmother Maacah, who is in the official position of queen mother. We don't know the responsibilities that she had, but we know that it was an official position because he took her out of it because she had made an idol of Asherah or to Asherah, so this pagan goddess. And we're told that Asa had peace until the last year of his reign, which brings us to chapter 16, how the peace was broken. Baasha, the king of northern Israel, decided to fortify a city named Ramah that's in between northern Israel and southern Judah. It's in between the two. Wanted to fortify it so that he could effectively control the trade route. No one could go to Israel or go to Judah without him controlling it. So Asa, he actually buys the allegiance of an ally of Israel. So he goes to Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, and pays him to break his allegiance with Israel and Baasha. And it works. As Ben-Hadad starts raiding Israelite territory, Baasha has to abandon Ramah and go and deal with that problem. Now, Asa actually gets in trouble for this move by a prophet of God named Hanani, who basically says, if you would have trusted in God with this situation and not made a deal with Ben-Hadad and the Arameans, you actually would have defeated the Arameans in war, in battle. And this seems to make this confrontation between Hanani, the prophet of God, and Asa, seems to make Asa angry for the rest of his reign. He actually gets a disease in his feet about 2 years before he dies, but there's a note in the Bible that he doesn't ask God to heal him. He only gets treated by his physicians. So there's a bit of bitterness. He doesn't go against God. He doesn't, go into idolatry, but he's angry over this decision that was made. Okay, chapter 17, Jehoshaphat, Asa's son, becomes king of Judah. And it's really interesting because the Bible talks about how he strengthened himself against Israel. So this warfare with Israel is still going on. So he stations troops in his fortified cities. He builds garrison cities, so military outposts and things of that nature in Judah. And we're told that Jehoshaphat was a good king. He sought God. He was devoted to God. He removed all of the high places that Asa hadn't got to, that he had left. And he actually, this is something unique that Jehoshaphat does. He sends a team of officials, Levites, and priests, just one team. There's a few men here to travel around the nation of Judah with the book of the law. So the book that Moses wrote down, the Torah, and go and read it and teach it to the people of Judah, instruct the people. And Jehoshaphat became very powerful. The people loved him. Even some foreign nations ended up making peace with Jehoshaphat. So chapter 18, here comes Jehoshaphat's big mistake. And it's not as bad as, going into idolatry, but it's not great. Okay, so Jehoshaphat allies himself. Remember, he's at war with Israel. And there's a peace treaty that he makes, which seems like a good thing. It stops warfare. He makes a peace treaty with northern Israel. And they seal the peace treaty with a marriage. Jehoshaphat marries his son to Ahab's daughter, Athaliah. Remember Ahab and Jezebel, the evil king and queen of the north? Yeah, them, their daughter. Okay, well, at least Ahab's daughter. I'm sure he had many wives. Definitely a daughter of Ahab. Okay, not good. So then there's this account of Jehoshaphat teaming up with Ahab to go fight against a place called Ramoth Gilead. And Ahab has 400 prophets of Baal prophesying, and Jehoshaphat won't go to war until he hears from a prophet of God. And it's a really interesting account. I would go back and read chapter 18 because it's really interesting. Micaiah, the prophet of God, ends up telling Ahab, you are going to die in battle. And we get to see how much Jehoshaphat actually believes in God and the word of God's prophets, because he still agrees even with this prophecy. Remember, the prophet said, you're going to lose and Ahab's going to die, but Jehoshaphat's not going to die. Jehoshaphat still goes into battle. He honors his treaty. He's a man of his word. And Ahab thinks that he can outwit this. So he has Jehoshaphat dressed in his kingly robes, and Ahab disguises himself. And it doesn't matter. Jehoshaphat cries out to God. Jehoshaphat is saved, and Ahab gets killed with a stray arrow. Okay, chapter 19. Jehoshaphat returns to Judah and Jerusalem, and a prophet, the son of Hanani, tells Jehoshaphat that God's wrath is on him because of this alliance with Ahab. But there's still hope. It's not completely lost because God is still pleased with Jehoshaphat's life. So interestingly, the response to this of Jehoshaphat, his response to God, he still follows God. He appoints godly judges in Judah to make sure that, the legal system is honoring God. And he has a priestly system of judges in Jerusalem. So he's still moving forward in righteousness. In chapter 20, we kind of get to see this wrath of God. So the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Edomites, these, famous enemies of Israel and Judah, they come to attack Judah. And Jehoshaphat leads the nation in praying and petitioning to God. So even though he knows that he's under God's wrath for a mistake that he makes, he prays and he goes before God. And God in return says he's going to rescue Judah and Jehoshaphat. They're not going to have to fight this battle, but they still need to march out to the battlefield, and God tells them where to go. Now, what's amazing is, in this enemy army, there is some sort of internal issue with these attacking forces, and they end up fighting against each other. And by the time Judah gets to the battlefield, all that they find are dead bodies, and they end up looting them for their weapons, which would have been extremely valuable, their shields, their weapons, their armor, and any valuables and food that they had been carrying with them. And what's really interesting is that this is often referred to as the Battle of Praise, because on their way to the battlefield, Jehoshaphat had gotten Levites together to sing praises all the way to the battlefield. So it's their praises to God, was their way of fighting this battle, which is very cool. Okay, there's also a small note here that Jehoshaphat tried to rebuild a place called Ezion-Geber. If you have a really good memory, or you paid attention to the account of Solomon, you will remember that rich King Solomon, built a fleet of merchant ships at Ezion-Geber, and these ships traveled to Ophir specifically to get gold, but they also traded in spices and exotic animals and things of that nature. So Jehoshaphat tried to do this with Ahab's son, who of course was wicked like Ahab, and as a result, a prophet came to Jehoshaphat and the ships were all destroyed. So it never got off the ground or away from the port, if you will. Okay, 2 Chronicles chapter 21. We have the account of Jehoshaphat's death, and the beginning of his son Jehoram's reign. We're told that Jehoshaphat had 6 other sons other than Jehoram, but that Jehoshaphat had wisely given them control over fortified cities in Judah, made them governors of sorts or commanders of sorts. And this is considered a very wise thing to do, because that meant that rather than all of these sons feeling like they didn't have a purpose because they weren't the next king of Judah, they had something to do, they had ownership. But we're told here in chapter 21 that as soon as Jehoshaphat dies, it doesn't matter, because Jehoram takes the throne and he has all his brothers murdered and some officials as well. And this is the Jehoram that was married to evil Ahab's daughter, Athaliah, who is quite the piece of work herself, as we will see. Okay, so Jehoram was an idolater. He actively promoted idol worship and pagan religions. He actually gets a letter from the prophet Elijah telling him that God is going to strike Judah and that Jehoram is going to end up with a bowel disease that's going to kill him. It's a terrible letter. And sure enough, we have enemies coming against Judah, and whether by force or by some sort of deal to save Jehoram's life, these enemies get all of the palace treasures and they kill all of the sons except for the youngest son of Jehoram, whose name is Ahaziah. So the Bible says here that Jehoram dies to no one's regret and was not buried in the kingly tombs, and no fire was burned in his honor. So we've gotten a little bit of hint. I can't talk about it too much because we're going to run out of time. But we've been given hints. If you pay attention to the deaths of the kings in Judah specifically, we're told that their bodies are adorned with spices and that there's a fire that's burned in their honor. It doesn't burn their bodies, but it's burned in their honor. And then the kings are honorably laid to rest in the tombs of the kings of Judah and Jerusalem. So Jehoram's body is not. No one liked this guy. Chapter 22, his son, Ahaziah, king of Judah, he only reigned for 1 year. His mom was Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab. His advisors were his mother and the Israelite officials, were told. And he is killed by Jehu in a coup to actually wipe out the dynasty of Ahab up in northern Israel. But because they have a peace treaty, their family with the northern Israelites, he's up there fighting battles with them and for them, and he ends up getting caught in the crossfires essentially and killed by the usurper to the northern throne, who is Jehu. Now, rather than mourning her son here in chapter 22, Athaliah kills all of her grandsons. She kills all of Ahaziah's sons so that she herself can become king of Judah and Jerusalem. She thinks she gets them all, except there's a daughter of Jehoram by another wife, not by Athaliah. So this would be, so it's all convoluted because the kings had multiple wives, right? So Jehoram was married to Athaliah, but he was also married to at least one other woman. And his daughter by this other woman is Jehoshaphat, and she rescues one of the baby boys of Ahaziah. So she rescues him from Athaliah, this crazy queen. And Jehoshaphat, we're told, though she's royalty, she's married to the priest Jehoiada, and they hide this baby in the temple for 6 years while he grows. Okay, mystery set up, or I guess intrigue set up. Now we're on to chapter 23. This is telling. This is a telling verse that people often just skip over. Verse 1 says this: in the 7th year, Jehoiada showed his strength. Jehoiada is the priest who is hiding the boy. Jehoiada showed his strength. So Jehoiada the priest makes a deal with the military commanders of Judah, makes a deal with the Levites that they are going to establish this baby boy who is now 7. His name is Joash. They're going to establish him as king. And we learn that Jehoiada the priest will essentially be co-regent. He's going to be acting king in the boy's place in all but name until the boy is old enough to take over. That's kind of the idea. So this coalition of military commanders and Levites and priests, they kill Queen Athaliah and any officials that are loyal to her. And Jehoiada Jehoiada makes a covenant between the people and him and the boy king and God that they will follow the ways of God. So this covenant thing that only kings do, we see Jehoiada the priest do. They also then tear down a temple of Baal that had been built in Judah, and they kill Baal's priests. Okay, chapter 24. Joash, king of Jerusalem, sort of. He was sort of king of Jerusalem at first. He is this young boy who becomes king. And in 24 verses 2-3, it says this: Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the years of Jehoiada the priest. Jehoiada chose 2 wives for Joash. Jehoiada the priest is the one who's calling the shots. He's basically acting king. Okay, we're told here that Joash rebuilds the temple. Great news after all that idol worship. And we get a record here of Jehoiada's death and Jehoiada's power. So I want to read to you verses 14 and 15. As long as Jehoiada lived, burnt offerings were presented continually in the temple of the Lord, which is great. Now Jehoiada was old and full of years, and he died at the age of 130. He was buried with the kings in the city of David because of the good he had done in Israel for God and for God's temple. Okay, so things about Jehoiada. He seemed to call the shots. He ensured religious observance. He's the one that made the covenant that the king normally made. And he was married to a king's daughter, to a daughter of David, in the line of David. He had a claim to the royal throne, and he was also very powerful because he had the loyalty of the military commanders and the Levites and the priests. So it's a big deal. Now, what we see here then becomes less surprising. After Jehoiada dies, he's never really yielded the kingship to Joash, doesn't seem. So after he dies, Joash becomes essentially full king. And what does he do? Joash decides to side with the officials of Judah who were idolatrous, who didn't agree with Jehoiada and his reforms. So they end up abandoning temple worship and integrating idols back into Jerusalem and Judah. Prophets of God came to prophesy, and the people didn't listen. Joash didn't listen. So God calls Jehoiada's son, Zechariah the priest, to prophesy against the people and against King Joash. This is very dangerous for Zechariah. This is not only the son of a very influential man, Jehoiada, but the son who was but the son of a man who essentially was king of Israel without the title, who has a claim to the royal throne. Zechariah does, because his mother was a daughter of King David, a granddaughter, great-great-granddaughter, you get what I'm saying, in the line of David. And he was buried with the kings. The people saw him like a king, Jehoiada, his father. So sure enough, Zechariah's prophecy is not taken well by Joash, and Joash has Zechariah stoned. Now, this apostasy of Joash explains then why an inferior army wins a war against Judah. An army that's smaller, it's less tactical, has less weapons. It wins against Judah because God has removed his protection. And a wounded Joash is actually murdered by his own officials for killing Zechariah. He went too far. Jehoiada and Zechariah were loved and acknowledged for their godliness, and he killed Zechariah. So also they do not bury Joash in the kingly tombs. So this is really an interesting dynamic here. Okay, 2 Chronicles chapter 25. Amaziah, king of Judah, the son of Joash. He does okay. He does what's right, but not wholeheartedly, the Bible says. He wins a battle in Edom. He brings back idols. That's the not wholeheartedly part. But this achievement, this military achievement, makes him really confident, and he ends up challenging Israel and getting beat horribly. Sections of Jerusalem's wall are torn down. The temple treasuries, like the storerooms, are raided by Israel. And Amaziah also gets murdered by his officials. So that's 2 kings now in a row in Judah and Jerusalem who have been murdered by their officials. Chapter 26, Uzziah. Here's a bit of a breath of fresh air, guys. He was 16 years old when he became king. He reigned 52 years. He tried. Uzziah tried to follow God. He was successful in warfare. He built many towns. He fixed up towers and the walls of Jerusalem. He focused on military training and military tech, like technology, which is interesting in chapter 26. We're told he really liked animals and farming. He just kind of seems like a jack of all trades here, interested in everything. But the problem with this success for Uzziah was pride. Maybe he had kind of done everything near the end of his reign. We're not really sure. But for some reason, he decides that he needs to explore the temple of God and go offer his own incense, which was illegal. You can't do this according to the law of Moses. It's only the priests who are allowed to do this. And the priests resist Uzziah. He doesn't care. And God strikes Uzziah with leprosy, which is a throwback back to Exodus. Remember when Miriam did the same thing? She confronted Moses and challenged Moses' authority, just like Uzziah was challenging the authority of the priests. And Miriam was struck with leprosy. Uzziah was struck with leprosy. But Miriam repented, and she was healed. Uzziah did not repent, and he wasn't healed. The Bible says that he had to go live in a separate house because leprosy is contagious, and his son Jotham is acting king in Jerusalem for him. And this is also when the prophet Isaiah begins to enter the picture here in Uzziah. Okay, chapter 27, Jotham, the son of Uzziah, he was faithful to God. He continued the work of Uzziah in building up the nation and the walls, and he was also successful in warfare. Sweet and simple. Chapter 28, Ahaz, the son of Jotham. Bad. He worshipped Baals. He sacrificed his children to pagan deities. So God delivered him into the hands of his enemies, the Arameans and the Israelites. There's a really interesting story in chapter 28 about a prophet of God who stops the Israelite army from taking prisoners from Judah. It's a really interesting one. And we learn how badly Ahaz messed up the temple in Jerusalem and the worship systems in Judah. And as his situation got more and more dire, rather than turning to the Lord, he got worse and worse and worse. Okay, chapter 29. Here we go. Hezekiah, a good king. Finally, he listens to the prophets. He listens to Isaiah. He repairs the temple. He reinstates true worship. And he makes a covenant. He renews the covenant in chapter 29. In chapter 30, Hezekiah celebrates a huge Passover. He invites people from Israel and from across the Jordan. So during Hezekiah's lifetime, northern Israel fell to Assyria. So that's something that Chronicles doesn't mention, but it's very important historically. He watched the northern nation of Israel fall, a nation bigger than him and stronger than him. So he's getting really serious with God. God is his protector, right? So huge Passover is celebrated in chapter 30. Chapter 31, this Passover and this dedication to God inspires the Israelites to go out on their way home and go on a mission of smashing all the idols they can find and tearing down pagan altars within the territory of Israel and Judah before they go home. And Hezekiah reestablishes the Levitical order in the temple because the temple hasn't been run as the temple was supposed to be run for a really long time. So he makes sure that the Levites have jobs and supports. Chapter 32, Assyria turns to Judah. It was inevitable. Hezekiah would have known it was coming. They begin to march into Judah and take the fortified cities. So Hezekiah orders all of the streams and water and rivers around Jerusalem to be completely blocked up. We learn elsewhere that he secures a water source for Jerusalem, which has actually been found today. It's a really fun study. It's called the Hezekiah's Tunnel. He fortifies Judah and Jerusalem as best as he can, but as Sennacherib is defeating the city of Lachish, which was the last stand before he would have made it to Jerusalem, he sends this letter mocking Hezekiah and the people. And Hezekiah and Isaiah pray. They bring the letter to God and they pray. And the angel of the Lord somehow defeats or battles against the Assyrian army enough that they're forced to leave in shame. So a lot of people think that this is probably a plague that breaks out. And so that he's spared. Hezekiah is spared, Jerusalem is spared, and we're told that people bring gifts to Hezekiah. People from around the country that didn't die by the sword bring gifts because he's now seen as spared by God, loved by God, right? Chapter 33, Hezekiah's son Manasseh. He is evil. He rebuilds the high places, the Baals and the Asherahs and the starry host worship, and he sacrifices his children. It's terrible. He even puts an idol in the temple of Jerusalem. Doesn't listen to the prophets. He ends up, and here's the part of the story that is not spoken of in Kings, but is only spoken of here in Chronicles. He ends up going captive to Assyria in disgrace. They hook his nose, and they have bronze shackles on his feet, and they force him to walk to Babylon, which was their city at that time. And while he's there, he repents and prays to God, and the Assyrians allow him to come back to Jerusalem as a vassal king, and he rebuilds the wall. He gets rid of idolatry. He tries to restore the temple. So he turns around, and this would be an important story for the audience of Chronicles. If you'll remember, the audience of Chronicles are people who have gone to Babylon in exile, and now they've come back to Jerusalem. So, even though they were evil, it's punishment going to Babylon, just like Manasseh, when they come back, there is a chance for redemption. So, this is an important addition here in Chronicles. Okay, we're also told about Manasseh's son Amnon, who was also bad news. He only reigned for 2 years before his officials killed him. So they had just had enough of evil kings, it seems like. Chapter 34, Josiah, the 8-year-old son of Amnon, becomes king. He was a good one, guys. He was faithful to God. He seeks God. He launches a campaign to purge the land of idolatry. He repairs the temple. He finds the book of the law and renews the covenant. Chapter 35, he too holds a Passover like Hezekiah. He holds a Passover in Jerusalem, which is great. In chapter 35, a pharaoh of Egypt, Pharaoh Necho, is marching to the city of Carchemish. Yes. And my pronunciations right now are crazy. Josiah ends up interfering. He stops them. He wants to battle Pharaoh Necho, and he ends up dying. Now, what this battle is all about is, remember that Judah has been an Assyrian vassal for quite some time, back to Ahaz. And the Assyrian Empire is falling. So Judah is experiencing freedom. And Egypt is marching to help Assyria resist Babylon. The Neo-Babylonian Empire is defeating Assyria, and that has been beneficial for Judah. So Josiah is wanting to intercept Pharaoh Necho and not let him go and help Assyria because they're just getting some of their freedom. But it backfires really bad. Josiah ends up dying in battle, and Judah becomes an Egyptian vassal. Okay, chapter 36, Josiah's son Jehoahaz only reigns for 3 months before the Egyptians come back and take him to Egypt and make a different son of Josiah king named Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim reigns for 11 years, and he is not a good king. During his reign, the Babylonians attack him as well. And they intend to bring Jehoiakim to Babylon and articles from the temple. But somehow Jehoiakim dies, possibly along the way, because 3 months later it says Jehoiachin, his son, only reigned for 3 months in Jerusalem before Nebuchadnezzar sends for him. And then Jehoiachin has to go to Babylon in exile. Jehoiachin's uncle, Zedekiah, is made king of Jerusalem. And Zedekiah he's the last king of Jerusalem. He does not listen to the prophets of God. He does not listen to Jeremiah. He ends up rebelling against Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and this leads to the fall of Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, has had it at this point. He's gone back and forth a few times with the kings of Judah and Jerusalem, and they're just proving too pesky. So he marches into Jerusalem. He destroys Jerusalem. He destroys the temple. And everything falls to Babylon, and exiles go to Babylon. Now, 2 Chronicles ends with a record of the Babylonian Empire being taken over, and Cyrus, history calls him Cyrus the Great, Cyrus, king of Persia, in his first year actually allows the exiles of Jerusalem to return to rebuild the temple. So we get that decree here at the end of 2 Chronicles. Interestingly, Ezra chapter 1, we're almost at the end here. Ezra chapter 1 opens with the same paragraph that closed Chronicles, this statement of Cyrus, this decree allowing the Judeans back to Jerusalem. Okay, so here in chapter 1, we're told all the different family heads of Judah, Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites who are going back. The exiles are going back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. We're told that Sheshbazzar, there we go. I knew I'd get it. I can't do it again. Sheshbazzar, the prince or governor of Judah, receives gold and silver dishes and plates and bowls and articles for the temple that the Babylonians had taken. So it's really exciting. Everyone's preparing to go back. In chapter 2, we have 11 leaders of the exiles and a huge list of people who returned with them to Jerusalem and Judah, including some people who couldn't even prove their family lineage back to Israel. But they wanted to come back anyway, even though they couldn't prove it. The documents had been lost. In chapter 3, they make it to Judah, and they settle in their own towns. Then they gather in Jerusalem, and Joshua the priest and Zerubbabel the governor, their first act is to build the altar of God to sacrifice on, and they institute morning and evening sacrifices and everything that we read about in Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, even though there's no temple yet. Okay, we're also told that they purchased cedars of Lebanon from Tyre and Sidon, and all of these interesting details about getting to work on the temple. Also in chapter 3, the foundation of the temple is laid, and the people hold a celebration to praise God, but there's mixed emotions. Some people are weeping and some people are crying. Chapter 4, the enemies of the exiles do not like the temple being rebuilt. They're living in the land. They don't want it to be rebuilt. And so they're putting roadblock after roadblock in front of the people, even writing a letter to the new king of Persia and actually getting a stop work order from the king of Persia so the people aren't allowed to work. Now in chapter 25, enter Haggai and Zechariah the prophets. We're going to get to their books later on in the Old Testament, but here in Ezra, they begin to prophesy to the people to rebuild the temple. So Joshua the priest and Zerubbabel the governor get to work again, regardless of all of the stop work order. And another letter by their enemies is written to the new king of Persia, Darius. In chapter 6, Darius actually finds the decree of Cyrus, and he upholds it. And the people finish the temple, and they celebrate Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. In chapter 7, enter Ezra the priest, the namesake of this book. We're reading the book of Ezra. So here's Ezra the priest. He comes to Jerusalem from Babylon. He was a teacher of the law, and he brought more returning exiles with him. But the purpose of him coming back was to teach and establish godly judges in Judah and to re-provide the temple in Jerusalem with enough priests and Levites to run it properly. Because it took a lot of people. It was supposed to take a lot of people, so they're coming out of exile. In chapter 8, we get a list of the family heads that returned with Ezra, and this is where we learn that Ezra specifically wanted to bring back workers for the temple, Levites and priests. We're even told that there wasn't enough who had volunteered, so he actually had to send for some to come with him. Ezra prays for protection as they go to Judah because they're carrying all of this wealth, a ton of wealth. There's a list of the wealth and the treasures that they were carrying, but Ezra didn't want to ask the king for a bodyguard or for protection of her military because he's been reading the king from Exodus and talking about God as if he is this great provider, protector. So he needs to trust God and have faith in God rather than have faith in the king. It works. They arrive in Jerusalem and they sacrifice to God, and they deposit all the treasures into the storehouses of the temple. 2 more chapters. We're so close. Chapter 9. When Ezra arrives, he realizes that people have been Levitical men and Israelite men who have come back have been intermarrying with pagan people. Now, in our culture today, the temperature that we're finding ourselves in today, right now, This chapter can easily be taken out of context and be made about race and racism. But listen to verse 14 here. Ezra says, "Shall we then break your commands again and intermarry with the peoples who commit such detestable practices?" See, this, as back in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, this rule about not marrying the pagan peoples, it wasn't because of nationality or skin color. It was because of their religious practices that were abhorrent to God and had horrible things going on. The people were not to intermarry and intermingle and bring those pagan practices into the worship of the true God. So that's what this was going on. Because remember, pagan people were allowed and did intermarry into Israel in good ways. But first, they became a part of Israel by becoming worshipers of God. They dedicated themselves to the God of Israel, so they weren't considered pagan people any longer. So this was about practices, specifically worship practices. So that's what was going on here. And they were just marrying people of these abhorrent religions. Okay, so chapter 10, very brutally, they call an assembly to call for divorce. And they establish these cases on a case-by-case basis, looking at each of them individually. And there ends up being about just over 100 marriages that had to be separated because of the different religious practices that were going on. Guys, we made it. We finished 2nd Chronicles and the entire book of Ezra. It was a mouthful. Let me know how your week went down below. Let me know if you have any questions of the reading that I covered today from the reading. Even if I didn't touch on a point from one of the chapters, if a question popped up while you were reading it through this week and you want to ask me, pop it down below. And I'll see if I can provide any insight or even a pathway for further study for you. I hope you have a really good week, and I hope you're excited for Nehemiah next week.